Where did Bill the Pony go after he died? And what happened to the mighty Shadowfax or the great eagles and Huan the Wolfhound when their time came? Throughout the Lord of the Rings, we see a variety of beasts with different levels of power and intelligence. What is their fate after death, and is that fate different depending on the animal? In order to answer these questions, let us first establish what a soul even is in Tolkien's legendarium. Within the Lord of the Rings, the soul is called Feia, and it is what resides within a person's hroa, meaning their body. The soul is immortal and never-ending, and it is granted by Eru Ilúvatar to his children, the races of elves, men, dwarves, as well as the Ainur, through what we call the Secret Fire, his flame imperishable. Those creatures that exist within a union of their Feia and Hroa, their soul and body, are known as the Incarnate, or the Miroanwe in Quenya. The nature of the souls of each race, meaning their fate and the soul's relationship with the body, is different depending on the wisdom of Ilúvatar regarding his children. Elves are immortal because it is within the nature of their souls to forever exist within the bounds of the world, and their Feia is returned to their Hroa when they die. The fate of the souls of men, on the other hand, is to exit the world, leave their temporary bodies behind, and presumably become one with God following their deaths. While the halls of Mandos can serve as a place to judge the soul, to delay it from its fate, what ultimately matters is that the nature of the fate of the soul cannot be changed, and has been willed by Ilúvatar himself based on what he deemed fit for each race. Despite their differences among the children, souls have certain indisputable and unchangeable characteristics. They are made in the image of God and therefore contain the capacity for free and independent will and thought, and contain within them consciousness. If a creature therefore has the capacity to think, to understand its existence, and is moreover able to do it freely, it has been touched by the secret fire. With that said, let us return to the fate of the animals. The animals of Middle-earth are the exact opposite of the Ainur. If the Incarnate, which are elves, men, etc., are beings whose nature is deemed complete when their souls are united to their bodies, the Ainur are beings whose natural state is to exist without a body, and are known as Ealar. Although the Ainur have the capacity to make a body for themselves, they do not require one for their existence to be complete, and can simply function as spirits. Their opposites are the animals, as they do not require a soul for their existence, and their nature is complete with only possessing a hroa, a body. Once they die, the vast majority of animals within Middle-earth cease to exist, and there is no afterlife for them. There are, however, exceptions to this, and Tolkien changed his mind countless times throughout his life regarding the nature of the beasts of Middle-earth. To answer my first questions, however, Bill the Pony, like the majority of animals, had no afterlife, and the same would be the fate of the noble Shadowfax when he died. As they are material creatures only, once the material is gone, they are too. There is no higher or spiritual existence for them, they simply are their bodies until they are simply not. The nature of the eagles, however, as well as Huan the Wolfhound, has been contemplated specifically by Tolkien. In the beginning, the professor had intended for the eagles and Huan to be Myra spirits that had been sent on their missions by the Valar in the forms that we recognize them as today. Ultimately, however, he changed his mind and made it so the eagles and Huan were animals like any other that had simply been taught speech by the Valar and sent to Middle-earth, which would then be in line with Tolkien's writings regarding the descendants of the great eagle Thorondor, hoping to avoid the concept of Maiar reproducing amongst themselves. This, however, caused a problem. While Tolkien wanted them to remain simple animals, he also wished to retain their intelligence and role within the story. That intelligence, however, pointed to these simple animals that had been taught speech as having souls, considering speech points to consciousness and consciousness points to Feia. Tolkien argued, however, that them possessing a relatively higher and perhaps even supernatural understanding compared to the common animal due to their training did not actually mean that they had rational souls like men and elves do, and therefore no afterlife. To put it in simple terms, you can imagine Huan's intelligence the equivalent to a dog that had been trained to perform incredible tricks and stands out above the rest due to its training, but in its fantastical version, in which that dog has been trained to the point where you might think it possesses a rational soul, even though it ultimately does not. Perhaps, considering how interconnected the Lord of the Rings is with Tolkien's Catholicism, the professor was concerned with giving any animal a soul similar to that of a human, as it would not only be a concept directly opposite, but even incomprehensible within the context of Christian theology. This is because, in Christianity, the soul is directly intertwined with God's image, God's kingdom, and God's intention for the world, and as such, a concept such as dog or eagle heaven heaven would be something completely out of the question. It should be mentioned, however, that even though animals are not recognized to possess an equivalent to human souls within Catholic dogma, their existence is sacred and an extension of God's grace, and are thus considered by some to possess lesser souls that may or may not cease upon material death, though Tolkien would have definitely believed in the former. As such, there were only two options. Either these creatures are actually shape-shifting Myra and will never die, or they are material beings whose existence is finite. For decades, the option that Tolkien had stayed with was the second. This was, until as revealed in The Nature of Middle-earth, the professor changed his mind yet again, and towards the end of his life, he clearly stated that the eagles were indeed Myra, therefore possessed souls, and ultimately, as Ainur, were immortal and did not require an afterlife. The most notable were those Myra who took the form of the mighty speaking eagles that we hear of in the legends of the War of the Noldor against Melkor, and who remained in the west of Middle-earth until the fall of Sauron and the dominion of men, after which they are not heard of again. This paints the picture that an important number of the great eagles, and perhaps the greatest among them, were indeed Myra, though perhaps a number of them that we see throughout The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings still are simple animals that have been taught a higher existence, a middle ground of sorts between his two previous decisions. While the picture became clearer for the eagles, Huan himself is never mentioned to be changed back to his original state alongside them. As such, the loyal wolfhound remained a simple dog whose being had been raised higher due to its interactions with the Valar, who nonetheless ceased to exist upon dying and experienced no afterlife. Nevertheless, considering Tolkien's decision regarding the eagles, it would not be impossible for Huan to share a similar experience to them, though it may be very unlikely. Lastly, to showcase Tolkien's way of thinking regarding the subject, a matter closely connected philosophically to this one is that of the Ents. Unlike the great eagles and Huan, the Ents seem to have been approached in a more consistent manner by the professor, and are said to have been cured of their dumbness by the elves, reminding us of the way in which Tolkien's animals were trained by the Valar. In contrast, however, the Ents were fully sentient beings from the beginning, and they held every characteristic of a soul, having been created at the behest of the Lady Yavanna following the forging of the first dwarfs by Elleth the smith. I think, even looking past his love for trees, it was easier for Tolkien to grant souls to the trees rather than the animals, as the concept of these trees being alive was the very thing that defined this fantasy race to begin with on a literary level. In terms of the lore itself, it is said that the Ents were either spirits sent to inhabit trees or beings that took the likeness of trees due to their fondness of them. Nonetheless, they were beings fantastical enough that could permit them having souls, and therefore an afterlife granted by God, in comparison to a topic as realistic as what happens to our beloved pets after death. At any rate, despite changing his mind regarding the nature of the eagles, and him turning some or all of them back into Myra, how the world of Middle-earth functioned when it came to animals in general did not change, as the eagles were simply removed from the category of animal altogether. In the end, within The Lord of the Rings, animals are physical beings that have no soul as we would imagine it, and are ultimately like a beautiful leaf that one day falls from its tree and is eventually no more. A massive thank you to my channel members, and thank you very much for watching.